All right, hello everyone. So today I want to talk with you about the legal environment of digital commerce. And I know before I start that typically this is not the favorite topic to talk when it comes to digital business, but it is nevertheless an important subject to cover. I decided to cover a couple of different thoughts on it, and I'm going to start with the very first one, which is how does the location of your business affect digital commerce? Now, one of the things that we know is that digital business allows us to reach customers in different countries, and this is a fantastic thing because it allows me to have customers in locations that if my store was just offline would not allow me to reach those customers. And this has many advantages like we saw before, but when it comes to laws, this creates a couple of problems. So let's see some of those issues. So in order to get started with it, this is something that it's real, for example, and it can attract a lot of attention. Back in the year of 2013, 2012, Apple Store got sued by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, which led Apple to have to reimburse $32.5 million of claims because of the way that they did to purchase apps on their App Store. So this was due to the fact that the Federal Trade Commission said that Apple was making it too easy, and therefore many kids and many children were buying the apps using the credit cards of their fathers without knowing what they were doing. And this was considered therefore a violation of the rights of the buyer to return the applications they bought. So they had to change that policy, and you can read more online. This was a case back in 2014, actually, sorry, not 2012. And it generated quite a lot of issues for Apple because they also had to change the way that they dealt with the suppliers of those apps, with the third parties that create applications. So here immediately you see one thing is that businesses have to comply with the same laws and follow the same penalties if they miss those laws, but at least in theory. Obviously, in the real world we all know that some businesses are different than others, but what we have is that the website or the web business is different because we have more complexity mixed into this. Well, number one, the first topic to add complexity to this is that the internet extends beyond traditional boundaries. So the laws of a country don't apply if you are in that country, but if you are in a different country, then different laws applies. So as you can imagine, this can be complicated because an internet business can have clients that are in many different countries. All right, so therefore this increases the complexity of the legal system. The internet also has more interactive relations or more interactive customer relationship management. In other words, because we are able to talk much more directly with the customer, this also includes some complexity because many customers might say that you promised something or you did not deliver something. And the fact that there is quite a lot of exchange of information between the customer and the client can mean that you actually not simplify things, but you increase the complexity due to the actual amount of information that you have available. Another thing is that you have is online communications. All right, indeed, I already mixed a little bit with the previous one. Do online communications make things easier for companies to deal with legal issues? Not necessarily, because as we know, a lot of times discussing something in person is very different from discussing something through the internet. And even, for example, that I am here and you can actually see me on this video, this is not the same experience as sitting with me in a class. All right. So finally, the other topic is law violations and ethical breach might create an instant reaction from the public online, and this another issue. Many companies, for example, that had issues, ethical issues, or created a legal problem, they saw an almost immediate backlash from their consumers online. And this can be a very positive thing because it brings attention to the public of things that companies should not be doing or should have not done. So, in the company perspective, this can be a nightmare because sometimes a mistake can lead to an avalanche of consequences. Another thing that I want to understand is that indeed countries are different from online, first of all, because of the borders. A country has very clear borders, but the internet does not. So this geographic location also will affect the cultural differences and the ethical issues that are within that country. So we see here that, and these things obviously will affect the way you create laws. So there's here a triangle of things, which is culture will affect the way that laws are created and will affect the ethical standards of the country. And each one of these three variables affects the other two. So it's a very fluid mix in a way. So what are the variables that affect the way that laws or countries operate when it comes to legal boundaries? Well, there's four main variables: power, effects, legitimacy, and notice. First one I want to talk about is power. So power is a form of control, and this is the form of control that governments have over physical spaces, over people, and over objects. Okay, so that means that governments have the power to control something. For example, with the recent coronavirus epidemic that we had, many governments have activated the power that they have to take control over national assets for the production of specific things, for example, masks. Right? So this is what we mean by power. Also, this is the main characteristic that defines statehood, in other words, the government's bodies, the government power. And the jurisdiction is the government's ability to exercise power. So so sometimes we say, oh, the government does not have jurisdiction over that matter. That means they don't have the power to actually affect that specific topic. On the other hand, effects is the impact of a person's behavior. And generally, this is stronger on things that are physically present, physically closer. So, for example, I might be much more willing not to do something that affects my local community rather than to do something that affects a location very far away. And that's because I feel much more connected psychologically to something that is physically closer to me. So that's why, for example, many people are much more willing to donate to causes that are in their country rather to causes, for example, that are in other countries, exactly because of this. And this affects the way that laws are created, because laws are created on traditional effect-based measures, which means like there's a problem, there's an effect, and this will create a consequence. But online, this does not work so well, because there is not this clear link between effect and between effects and consequence of the action that the law would create. And also, again, linking to before, a lot of times there is no jurisdiction. Just because a country creates a law for internet business in one place does not mean that it will affect something that will happen in another country. The last one is legitimacy, and this is the idea of that those subjugated to laws should have a role in formulating them. In other words, the fact that if someone is affected by laws, in a way they should be part of the way those laws are created. That's why we have voting system. That's why, for example, there is lobbying by big corporations, although I'm against it, obviously, but there is many issues here that legitimacy affects is the way that those new laws might be created, the impact of how the people affect the generation of laws. And also, obviously here, the problem is that online businesses, they face a variety of regulations, and a lot of times they don't have the impact or the power to be able to modify or to affect the creation of those new laws. So, the other one is notice. Now, notice is the expression of the change of rules, the fact that something is changing. And this is very easy on physical boundaries, because in physical boundaries, it's very easy to enforce those. For example, if a country, like, again, recently dictates a curfew, this is much easier to do on specific locations or on a country, rather, for example, on the whole of European Union, because the area is much larger. Now, so here, the size of the geographical location always affects. But what is the main problem? The problem is that this is easy to enforce online. For example, close the borders, just put the military there and the border is closed, pretty much done. But online does not work like that. Online, there is no boundaries, there is no control over the information that comes from one country to another, and therefore this becomes much harder to manage. So here there is also two things I want to associate with the fact that of change of laws. Well, ignorance of law is not a legal entitlement that you can have, let's say, that justifies your behavior. So for example, I say, oh, I didn't do something because basically I did not do something because I did not know that I had to do it. So this is not a legal defense. On the other hand, a lot of times what happens is you have customers that are coming to your website that come from other countries, but you don't know, for example, and therefore, what is the laws that apply to them? Does the law that apply to your country, do you also have to make it for the customer that is arriving at your website when you don't know where they're coming from many times? So as you can see, it's a very complex issue. Now, so what happens in terms of jurisdiction over the internet? Okay, this is, first of all, it's extremely hard because there is no internet country. There is no country that says we control the internet. All right. Now, some countries have tried to place rules in place. For example, China has created many things that bans or allows access to specific locations online. But even this, there's many ways around it because many people, for example, can install a VPN which allows them to fake the signal of their location into another country. So here, the other two concepts I need to understand is the concept of contract. And here a contract happens when there's two parties that agree to exchange something, and they agree to exchange something both of value. Okay, and immediately here we see that there are a couple of issues here, because if those two people are located in two different regions physically, then that means they might have different laws applying to that contract. But I will talk about that later. And another important concept to know for now is the concept of tort. This is an intentional negligent action taken by a legal entity that causes harm to another legal entity. In other words, this is when someone in the contract, and to simplify, let's imagine that I have a contract only between two people, and one of those people creates something that, in other words, will create a harm to the other person. And by harm I mean obviously physical, that would be crime, but here we talk mostly about financial harm. For example, the fact that I say that I will deliver a product, I accept the payment, but then I don't deliver that product, or I don't deliver the service, or I say that I delivered the service with a certain quality, but then in reality I did not. So this is, in other words, it's not directly breach of contract. This is much more complex, but is when there is indeed a non-delivery of what was stipulated on that contract. So as you can see, there's four main categories, like I said, that affect the difference between physical boundaries and legal boundaries. And physical boundaries is different from legal boundaries because legal boundaries tend to be much larger than just the physical boundaries. All right. So those four things that will affect will be power, effects, legitimacy, and the notice. And this is why internet businesses, when it comes to manage them in terms of legal aspect, they're much more complex than offline businesses. Right. Now, regarding the part about what is the location or what is the place where the disputes can be settled when there is a problem, or under what laws do you fall? Well, there's two things here to consider. What is the nature of the dispute, and where are the parties located? The nature of the dispute, we call it the subject matter jurisdiction, and this has to do with what is the type of problem that there is. So, for example, many countries will have different types of court depending on the problem that you have, while other countries will have, for example, courts for commercial purposes, courts for family purposes, courts for other things. But therefore, what happens here is you have to see what is the matter that you have to do. And sometimes this is not very clear, because if you have a complex issue, like something that has to do with trade across different countries, there might be a dispute of to what court should I go in order to file a complaint against a competitor, for example, right? So personal jurisdiction here can be, most of the times it's easy because most of the times the parties involved in the case are located in the same place. But what happens when one of them is not located in the same country? So again, it adds complexity. And when we're dealing with internet businesses, this is very common. So personal jurisdiction, like I said, just a couple of extra points. A person has the option to submit to the other person's location. So if I have a dispute and the person I'm having a dispute with is located, for example, in Belgium, I might decide, look, I'll abide by the laws of Belgium when it comes to this matter. So there's always that option. But many countries have bilateral agreements that allow these disputes to be agreed on more easily. And therefore, if you are selling something that is complex, I advise you to always check what is the laws in different countries for the type of product or the service that you're trying to provide. So here, once again, we can see that to divide what I said before about tort actions or tortious actions, I want to say here that there are two main types of these type of actions. When there is a breach, or when someone does not deliver what they promise, or there is something they did not follow in terms they created harm to the other party. So there's two options here. There's what we call negligent tort, which is a type of action that it was done, let's say, by accident or unknowingly, but that nevertheless created harm for the other person. Or there is intentional tort, which happens when actually it was created by someone on purpose. And these two will have very different connotations when it comes to managing it in court. So now, coming to international commerce, like I said, there's another topic I want to say is that if many companies, when two big companies are in dispute over a matter and they're located in two different countries, a lot of times governments get involved. And when a government gets involved, there's a couple things that can do. So for example, a government might create what we call a judicial committee, which means that they will enforce the other country's laws on this specific case out of a sense of friendship, out of a sense of trying to ease the political impact of something. In other words, they might give away this to try to ask a favor later, for example, like in a more broad sense of politics. And this can indeed happen, and it's something to consider when doing internet businesses as well. So this is therefore, as you can see, this is a very complex issue, and what we notice is that things are rapidly changing in terms of the way that we are doing business online. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't want to be scared of doing business online. All I'm saying is that indeed there is these things to consider. A lot of the things that I mentioned up until now, they only happen to very large corporations, but that does not mean that it would not affect smaller businesses as well. So one of the other issues we have is conflict of laws. So what happens when the laws that address the same issues have conflicting points of view? So here, online businesses, as I told you, they are in many different locations, and when this happens, we tend to look into national, federal, or union laws for a guidance. So as an example here, I put direct wine sales industry. So many countries have laws regarding the sale of alcohol online. Okay, and that means that a lot of times, obviously, you cannot sell alcohol to minors, for example, in the real world or online either. But what problem here happens is, how can an online business confirm if someone is above the age of 18 or not? Okay, and if it is proven that a person that below the age of 18 bought the alcohol online, whose fault is it going to be? Now, some countries might say that it's the fault of the seller. Other countries might say that it's the fault of the buyer, and therefore we have here situations where the same two different countries might say opposite things related to the same subject. And this has happened a number of ways, many times in court cases related to international business, and especially nowadays is happening more and more when it comes to online. Most courts nowadays are going with the point of view that the law should be applied according to the location of the seller, because managing the location of the buyer is extremely complex. Other point very quick that I want to make is the concept of contracts. There's a couple of ideas I want to throw here because it will affect as well later on. So what is a contract? A contract is formed when one party accepts the offer of another party. That's what a contract is. And for that, we have to understand the concept of offer. An offer is a commitment with certain terms made to another party, but this commitment can be revoked if both parties typically agree, or if there is a breach on the uses of that contract. Typically, the easiest or the most common way for a contract to end is when both parties agree to finish that contract. But there are many situations where one company wants to end it, but the other one does not. And therefore, we enter a negotiation until a compensation is found. But I'm not going to get into that because, to be honest, I'm definitely not the most qualified person to talk about that. So, acceptance, on the other hand, is the expression of willingness to take an offer that is included in the terms. And therefore, it means that if two parties sign a contract, that means that they accept the terms that are on that contract. And it means as well that therefore both of them agree with everything that is said on the contract. And this is what we call acceptance. Consideration, on the other hand, is the agreed upon exchange of something valuable. In other words, a contract determines that I am exchanging something for something else, typically a service or a product for money. Typically, there are many other situations where I might trade, for example, products and services for other products and services. So, but just a quick thing, in many countries, implied contracts are legally binding. What does that mean? It means contracts, for example, that are done verbally without a written contract. And this can be legally binding indeed if there are witnesses. So just because you don't have a signed contract, attention, there are many countries where you don't need one, and there are many situations where you don't need that. So, creating contracts, we're talking about offers and acceptances. So every type of agreement or exchange between parties is a type of contract. And this is very different from traditional and internet businesses because the type of contracts we do is different. For example, most contracts are offline, let's say in traditional, there's not a written there is most of the time, a written document, but online there is also a written document, but I might not be able to immediately see. For example, a lot of times when you install something and you click accept, there is a contract behind it, but it's just you did not read it, or it was not obvious a lot of times that it was there. So internet communications here have offered many different types of acceptance, and nowadays you can accept a contract by, for example, sending an email, or by accessing an EDI, or by filling out web page forms. So there's many different ways, and also contracts online can be combined with traditional methods. For example, contract online might generate a document that is sent to you by mail, or it might generate something. For example, I might create a contract online to pick something in a store. So therefore, it is possible to get contracts that are combined. Now, typically online, the thing that we see the most is a page like this that I give on the example. So the step one, there is an invitation to an offer, a product that is offered for a specific price. Then there is the offer itself, which the buyer adds to the cart, okay? And this means that he accepts the offer. And the acceptance part, this means that he saw and he selected the offer. The acceptance part is when he actually makes the payment because he accepts the offer that he selected. So we go through this without thinking, but in reality, this is a buying contract. And therefore this affects, and it is legally binding towards the action that we took. So there's many different ways to accept contracts. The most traditional ones is what we call, the old ones was the shrink wrap acceptance. This is the fact that if you open the product, for example, and if you break the seal, that means you accept that product. Nowadays online we have different ones. We have, for example, the click wrap contract, which means you click on something, typically you say you accept to use the terms, and that is your legal contract saying that you accept the terms that were imposed to you. Or a lot of times, as well, you have the web wrap acceptance, which means that the fact that you are using that website implies that you accept the terms and conditions of that website as well. Okay, so all these are legally binding, like I said, and this is type of contracts that we operate every time that we go online. So we also call, a lot of times we also have what we call the terms of service. Now this is a little bit different because many sites will have rules about the visitors, or rules that the visitors must follow, even though the visitors many times are not aware of these rules. Many of you, for example, use Instagram or social medias, and there's many rules behind how to use these platforms, about things that you can or things you cannot do. But most of us did not actually go and read those rules. So we call these the terms of service. And this is an agreement that says that while you use this platform, you accept to follow specific rules on to use that platform. So why do we have this? Because this will limit the website owner's liability in case there's an issue. So for example, if someone posts something on Instagram that is considered offensive or racist or something pledging something illegal, for example, then the platform itself can in a way say that this is not us, because according to the terms and conditions, we are not legally bound, we are not legally responsible for the content posted on this platform. So here, what happens is the site user is the one that accepts some of the consequences or the consequences of the actions that they take on that site. So just another thing, written contracts, and when we say written and signed contracts, they're not always mandatory. Many countries say what are the type of contracts that should be. Typically, there's a value of amount of money where a contract should be legally binding. For example, in most countries, you need a written actually in all countries, you need a legal contract to buy property, for example. Here, you cannot go beyond that. In other countries, you don't need a written contract to buy a computer, for example. So there are some differences here. For electronic commerce writing, there's many different ways to reduce this tangible form, but typically what happens is there's electronic signatures, or many companies might sign with a seal, for example, that represents their authorized signature. And this would be a written contract, even though it's in electronic format. So then we could also talk about guarantees, and in terms of warranties, most countries have a legal establishment upon what is the type of warranties that they will use, or that is the minimum. For example, for electronic products, many countries say that the minimum warranty is 1 year, but the company can always go beyond that warranty. Okay, you can always go beyond. Warranties or legal warranties just state the minimum. All right, then what companies that sell products or services must do is to create the disclaimers. In what case you will not obey the conditions of the warranty. So for example, many times when you buy a laptop and it clearly says, if you open your laptop, then you expire your warranty. You don't, the company will not be responsible anymore for any problem on the laptop if you opened it yourself, for example. So there's many things here to consider in terms of warranty, but most of the cases, most countries have laws in regards to this, and you have to obey the laws of that country if you are selling towards that country. So one of the last sections I want to cover is intellectual property, and when it comes to intellectual property, there's a lot of things we could talk. So regarding the use of intellectual property, this is an extremely complex issue. I'm just going to try to point the main areas where you need to be careful when doing business online. First of all, intellectual property is any creation of the human mind, both tangible and intangible. And many countries will have laws in place to protect these things that were created. Okay, and the right of publicly using such work is protected by law, and especially, for example, especially when it comes to commercial use. So any image, any symbol, anything that you use for your business, you have to be careful. Do you have the copyrights, or do you have the commercial right to use it? There's many platforms online that allow you to download free commercial royalty pictures, for example, or symbols, or even music, but obviously this will be very limited, okay, because this is the main way to which artists create or make their money. So online businesses must avoid infringement of intellectual property rights by using unauthorized content on webs. What does this mean? It means that you cannot simply go and copy an image or copy something from another website and use in your own website. That is illegal. My brother, for example, had this issue. He's a photographer, and he started an online business in Portugal selling carpets. And what happened was someone else started copying the pictures of his website to use on their own website. But the problem here is that this is extremely hard to prove. So what he had to do was to protect himself by actually putting watermarks on his pictures from then on. And this solved some of the issues, but it's still, obviously, it is unfair, especially for the artists. Nowadays, there's many websites that give you very accessible prices to the materials that you need, and therefore it's not worth the risk of trying to do it. So let's start with copyrights. Most countries, copyrights is the right granted by a government to the author or the creator of a specific artistic piece. And typically in most countries, this copyright lasts for 50 years up until 50 years after the death of the creator. And after that, many of the works might become what we call public domain. So this is why, for example, you can go to a music store and get so many different albums from Beethoven, for example, from many different publishing houses, because there's already been quite a lot of, it's been already many years since the death of Beethoven, so now his music has become public domain. On the other hand, more recent artists, for example, if you try to buy an album from Metallica, for example, there's only one copying house because, well, all of them are still, thank God, alive. Now, copyrights here, they give the access, they give the author the exclusive right of their work, and therefore they can sell it to whoever they want. Obviously, there's contracts for this, and it will include any type of artistic form or intellectual expression. But attention, ideas that are contained in an expression cannot be copyright. All right, so for example, you cannot copyright a mathematical equation. You cannot copyright, for example, a physics compound, for a physics formula, for example, because they don't although they represent intellectual property, although they represent a creation, but they cannot be copyright. Right. So also a collection of facts cannot be copyright unless it is arranged in a way that is considered original work. So for example, Yahoo Web Dictionary, this is original work, even though all the information there are facts and are things that already existed, but they organize it in a manner that made it original. So here it comes the concept of fair use, and fair use means that you can use some parts of work of other people. All right, so for example, you can use a book, all right, to make a critique, because copyrights allow you to use some a part of the work. Okay, so the fair use of copyright work is exemptions in terms of infringement. There's some exceptions here, like I was mentioning. For example, copyright can be used for criticism, for comments, for news reporting, for teaching, for scholarship, or for research. In these cases, it's fine, because but you cannot use, let's say, and take credit for the work of other people. Let's say, again, if you're doing an essay, you cannot just copy an essay of another person 100%, but typically you can use up to 15 to 20% of other people's work to help you build your own argument. So there's some issues here to take into consideration. So you can use certain parts of copyrights of other things, but typically if you're talking about education, you have a much better chance of qualifying than, for example, if you are compared for commercial use. Court might consider painting using different standards than sound recording, for example. Small sections qualify when the entire work might not. So for example, I can give you photocopies of a chapter of a book, but I cannot give you photocopies of the whole book, for example. And it also we have to consider is as well, if you use the work of other people, court might also consider how much did you affect negatively the work of the other person. So it can be quite complex indeed. Patents, on the other hand, those are legal protections for things that you created, and there are exclusive rights granted by governments to an individual to make, use, or sell an invention. Now here there's two major types of patents, international and locals. Local patents or national patents are easier to get, but still they take quite a lot of time. International patents, on the other hand, take much longer, but they give you a more international coverage. What does that mean? You might have a patent for a product in the United States, but I can copy that product in France, for example, and will not get effect for it unless you have an international patent. And there's many little issues here. For example, many softwares don't have any patents because by the time the patent process is over, the software is obsolete. So therefore, it increases the bureaucracy here, does not go at the same speed as technology change. Another thing to consider is trademarks. Those are distinctive marks, devices, mottos that that are attached to a company for their good or products for identification purposes. And you typically see the symbol that you have on the screen, this TM, which means trademark. It's a trade name, and it's the name that the business uses. So, for example, the name Coca-Cola is a trademark, but the logo Coca-Cola, that's something different. Okay, so we need to be careful when using websites. You cannot use someone else's trademark or logo without their permission. I cannot put, for example, the Coca-Cola logo on my business website if I don't get their permission. Then here there's a couple of, just out of curiosity, just want to show you this, but there's a couple of interesting things online. For example, many companies do what we call cyber squatting. Cyber squatting is basically when you buy domain names with names that are very appealing, and then you wait in the hope that someone will want to buy that domain. All right, so I registered it and I hope that someone will want to buy it from me, and obviously I sell it at a big profit. So this there's the World Organization, there's the World Intellectual Property Organization that tries to fight against this, because they believe it's in a way it's taking advantage of trademark regulations. But the reality is 90% of the cases they rule in favor of the person that owns the domain trademark. So therefore it doesn't really do much. All right, because there's no central authority here that can actually establish regulations on this for the entire world. The other one is typo squatting. This one is a little bit different, which is I create variations of a certain domain with common typos. So for example, keys like, for example, if I want Coca-Cola, for example, I might put Coca-Cola, but at the end, instead of an A, I might put an S, for example, because the S is right next to the A on the keyboard. And here it's for the purpose of creating misspells of that domain, to try to make people land on a different page that would generate income for someone else, for example. And this is quite often, this happens quite a lot, to be honest. There's many cases like this, and again, it's very hard to say that they have to close their domain, because there's no court that can force that. In terms of other, but getting into the part other online. Okay, in terms of protection of intellectual property online, there's many softwares that can do this. I suggest you do a little bit of research on Verance and Digimark or in BlueSpike. They give watermark or control over specific things, but this is something that it's more technological. I just wanted to show you because there are mechanisms indeed to protect you online as well. In terms of defamation, obviously whatever you write online is registered, and therefore you can get in trouble for things that you did, with the exception of criticizing public figures. Criticizing public figures in most countries, it's fine, because as public figures, they lose the rights of protection in these cases. But for example, if I go and I insult someone at work, this is considered defamation, because that person is probably not a public figure. Then in terms of deceptive trademarks, we have many situations, websites, for example, that change logos, or fake sites that claim to be someone else. There's so many things online that do this, and therefore this trademark, what we call the use of other people's property, obviously it's illegal. And one of the things is, a lot of times you as a business, you have to search for companies or for other websites that might be trying to impersonate your business. Finally, in terms of online crimes, obviously hacking of facilities has been something that is huge, and there's been many hacking breaches in the past couple of years alone, where hackers have stolen information out of private companies. Sometimes this was to show that that company was doing something illegal or dishonest. Other times was just simply as an act of cyber terrorism. But on that case, I would actually like you to suggest to watch a video called, a TED Talk called Cyber Warfare by Amy Zegart. It's really good. I put the link on the description below, because she explains the difference between online and offline world when it comes to responding to threats. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my little description of some of the legal issues that affect online businesses. If you have any questions, just drop a question on the comment section below. And in the meantime, I'll see you in the next video.